So, what does it really mean to be a chosen people? It's a huge idea, right? One that has literally shaped nations, inspired incredible faith, but also fueled some of the most intense conflicts in human history. Today, we're going to break down this powerful and, deeply controversial concept.
Okay, let's just dive right in. For one group of people, this idea of being chosen can be this incredible source of identity, of strength, and resilience. But, if you're on the outside looking in, that very same idea can sound a lot like a claim of superiority. It can feel exclusive, maybe even offensive. And it's right there, in that tension, that this whole concept gets its power and its controversy.
All right, to really get to the heart of this, we have to go way back to the source. We're talking about the biblical story of the Mosaic Covenant. This was a pact, an agreement made thousands of years ago that is still making waves today.
Now, the thing about the Mosaic Covenant is that it wasn't some kind of gift with no strings attached. Not at all. It was a conditional, two-sided deal between God and the nation of Israel. Think of it less like a blank check and more like a formal treaty. Blessings were definitely on the table, but they completely depended on the people holding up their end of the bargain.
And you can see the terms laid out so clearly here. On one side, God promises to make Israel this treasured possession, a holy nation. But look at the other side. The obligation was huge, to obey God's law completely. The blessings were never guaranteed. They were directly, and I mean directly, tied to their faithfulness.
And this quote, this really gets to the core purpose. See, being chosen wasn't just about being a favorite. It was about being set apart for a specific job, a specific role, to be a kingdom of priests, a nation that could act as a kind of moral guide, a light to the rest of the world.
But that original understanding of the covenant? Well, that's not where the story ends. Not by a long shot. Over time, a different interpretation came along, one that follows a totally different narrative arc.
So the Quran actually enters this conversation by acknowledging that original covenant with the children of Israel. But, and this is a huge but, it also argues that the conditions of that sacred deal were ultimately broken.
And from this perspective, we're not talking about minor slip-ups. Repeated acts of disobedience, things like disbelieving in divine signs or even killing prophets, well, that was seen as a fundamental violation of their whole agreement with God.
And this is the pivotal moment in this alternative narrative. After that perceived violation, the mantle of leadership, that special status, was transferred. It was passed on, like a torch, to a new community, the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, who were now given the task of carrying that divine message forward.
So the theological logic here is actually pretty straightforward. You've got these 3 steps. From this point of view, the status of being chosen was never about your race or your lineage. It was always conditional on righteousness. And hey, if something is conditional, that also means it's transferable.
Okay, so how do these ancient theological claims and counterclaims actually affect the real, messy modern world we live in? This is where ancient text becomes modern territory.
Scholars have a way of looking at this dynamic through a pretty neutral lens. They call it religious genesis. It's basically this natural process where a new faith defines itself in relation to the ones that came before it, sometimes adopting ideas, sometimes correcting or even condemning others. It's a pattern you see all throughout religious history.
But this idea isn't just some dusty old theology. It has a really powerful modern function. Sociologists see chosenness as a kind of tool for survival. It creates this intense group cohesion, it deepens the connection to a specific homeland, and man, it can be a powerful force for mobilizing a people, especially when they're facing hardship. And then, in the 20th century, these deeply held religious beliefs about a chosen people and a promised land just collided head-on with the hard realities of geopolitics. You have colonial agreements, political declarations, war, and occupation. And suddenly, these ancient ideas become the blueprint for a modern nation-state. And of course, a modern conflict. And the consequences of that collision have been just staggering. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 led to what Palestinians call the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. Over 750,000 people were displaced from their homes. This is the moment a theological concept becomes a lived human crisis that is still very much with us today. So, given this really difficult and fraught history, a lot of modern thinkers and theologians are starting to ask a pretty radical question. Can this idea of chosenness be redefined for a world where, like it or not, we all have to find a way to live together?
The shift they're proposing is actually pretty profound. It's an attempt to move away from the idea of being chosen over other people and move toward the idea of being chosen for a specific purpose. It's about reframing chosenness not as some kind of privileged status, but as a heavy responsibility.
And this chart here, it just nails the difference perfectly. Is a group the chosen people, which kind of implies that no one else is, or are they a chosen people, just one among many, with each group having its own unique mission? You can see how that second view focuses way more on fulfilling a role, like being that light to the nations, instead of just holding on to a title.
At the end of the day, what this all shows us is that ideas have real-world consequences. They can draw borders on a map, they can build nations, and they can absolutely fuel conflicts. But ideas can also change. They can evolve. So the big question for our time, the one we're left with, is this. Can we reinterpret the very ideas that divide us to maybe find a new way forward together?